Hello everyone, welcome back to Unbiased Election Predictions, and today I am back with episode 2 of our All About series, and we've got a lot to cover today. A lot. Literally. Alaska is the biggest state in the United States, and I'm going to attempt to cover the vast expanses of the state to the best of my abilities. But before we get started, I'm going to take a moment to ask you to subscribe. And before we skip this part of the video, if you're not subscribed, you might miss one of my videos, so hit that red button and turn on notifications so you catch every one of my uploads. And now, without further ado, Alaska, land of snow, big mountains, and the beautiful northern lights. Now, contrary to popular belief, Alaska is not, in fact, located in the Pacific Ocean next to Hawaii. Rather, it is up north and shares its only border with Canada. This border is 1,538 miles long, making it by far the longest border that a U.S. state shares with another land entity. In fact, this border is more than twice as long as the runner-up, the Oklahoma-Texas border. But either way, Alaska is huge. It covers 570,665 square miles, but those are just numbers. So to illustrate how big it is, I'm going to show you this map created by Metric Maps. 19 states can fit in Alaska. And if Alaska were a country, it would be the 33rd largest in the world out of more than 230, falling in between Venezuela and Nigeria. It is also twice the size of the state of Texas, and would make up a fifth of all land size in the lower 48 United States. Not only that, but Alaska's shoreline, the one that's frozen most of the time, is longer than all of the U.S.'s borders with the Atlantic coast. However, across all of this land, there are only 731,000 people, which is just around the 10th of the size of the state I talked about earlier, Alabama. However, these 731,000 people are a pretty interesting bunch that we'll begin to analyze right now. So first of all, the average Alaskan lives to be around 76 years old and makes a little over $44,000 a year. The annual GDP of the state is $49 billion. A little over 60% of Alaskans identify as white, and around 16% are Native American, 7% are Hispanic, and 4% are black. However, Alaska's demographics didn't always look like this. In fact, people first came to Alaska in 10,000 BCE. At the time, there was a ginormous land bridge that extended from Siberia, which allowed people to come across to what is now Alaska. These people are considered to be Native Americans, and today many of these ethnic groups still reside in the state, most notably the Athabascans, Aleut, Inuit, Yupik, Tlink and Haida. Although I'm going to attempt to inform you about these ethnic groups to the best of my abilities, remember that I simply cannot cover everything because of how fascinating and complex some of these cultures are. But first, I'm going to show you my Alaska region map, which should give you a preview of what I'm about to talk about next. So at the top we have the North Slope, which is just all of North Slope County, which we'll get into later. Most people who live in this region are indigenous people, with the district being 60% minority. Next, the region labeled Athabascans is, as you can probably guess, the area of the state where most Athabascan people live. The western Yupik area is, as the name suggests, the home of most Yupik people, and the Aleutian Peninsula / islands near it are part of the Aleut area. Directly east of this is the region labeled Kenai, which encompasses most of the Kenai Peninsula. The smallest district by land size, a cyan dot labeled Liberal Anchorage, is the downtown area of Anchorage. The largest city, we'll talk about that later as well, which tends to skew more left, whereas the other small region that I call the Business District is the more conservative part of the city. Highlighted in purple is the Fairbanks area, and then down below, the Athabascan region, there's the Eyak territory, home to the Eyak indigenous people. The last two regions are the small yellow area, home to the capital of the state, Juneau, and the aqua-colored southern area is the Tlinkit region. The Tlingit are one of many Native American tribes we'll get into now. So first, the Athabascans are, like all of these groups, indigenous peoples that inhabit most of Alaska and parts of Canada. Per Wikipedia, they are the original inhabitants of the interior of Alaska. Anyways, most Athabascans are fishers and hunter-gatherers, fishing primarily in the Yukon River. They most notably enjoy eating moose and salmon, which they are very efficient at catching. They traditionally live in smaller groups of 20 to 40 people that migrate all across the land. Then there are the Aleut people. The Aleutians live mostly in the southern Alaskan islands and parts of Russia, specifically the islands near Kamchatka. They have one specific language, Unangamtunu, which is spoken by only around 150 people worldwide. This is a minute number compared to the more than 25,000 speakers before European contact. This is mostly due to the Russian-American trading company cruelly relocated to islands across the Bering Sea. The Inuit people are probably the most well-known tribe in the state, or at least from my perspective. Inuits are pretty spread out across the globe and reside in more than one continent. They live in parts of Russia, Alaska, Canada, as well as Greenland. The Inuits also have many gods, 16 of which I could find information about. There's a Glulik, a spirit that lives under the ice and helps them with fishing. There's Apalovik, an evil god who lives in the depths of the ocean who can bite you. However, Auchinleck is a bit of a friendlier god, and it's said that he controls the whales that live throughout the ocean. There's also a bit of confusion on what his name actually is, because according to Wikipedia, it's Alanurk, whereas on firstpeople.us's glossary of Native American gods, it's Auchinleck. Moving on, Auchna is the goddess of childbirth, and Guta is the god of the dead. Aningen is the god of the moon, and Ekchua is the god of merchants. Now, perhaps the scariest god is, wait for it, and yes, I'm going to have to have multiple takes to pronounce it, Erdelir Virisisong. I'm terribly sorry if I butchered that pronunciation, which I probably did. He is the demon cousin of the moon, and sometimes he comes out into the sky dressed as a clown trying to make people laugh. It's advised you don't laugh at him though, because if you do, he will freeze your intestines and eat you.
That's a lot of damage!
Lastly, Kelute is an evil spirit who lives on Earth as a dog. The most powerful god is considered to be Tekit Surtok, who owns all the deer across Earth. So then there's the Yupik, who live mostly in the western part of the state. Unlike a lot of these other groups, they are almost exclusively Alaskan, so you probably won't find too many people who identify as Yupik in Canada or Russia, the way you would find other, let's say, Haida people. Funny I mentioned that, because next on my list of Native American groups to cover is in fact the Haida people. Interestingly enough, the Haida actually aren't an Alaskan tribe. They're mostly from Canada, and they actually come from the Haida Gwaii archipelago in western Canada off the coast of British Columbia. However, a small portion of Haidas do actually live in the southern part of Alaska, so they do qualify as an Alaskan ethnic group and are protected by various laws passed by Congress to protect minorities. Now, the last major group that we haven't touched on that live in the state of Alaska are the Tlinkits, a group of around 17,000 people today. The Tlingit are an inland group, meaning that they only inhabit areas that are, for the most part, surrounded by land. Their language is also pretty similar to the Athabascan language, so you can probably say that these two groups are pretty related, that they likely came across the land bridge at the same time. You know, back when Alaska had that border with Russia that isn't really a thing anymore. In fact, today Alaska only borders one country, Canada. As I mentioned earlier, its border is huge partially because of how big Alaska is. Alaska stretches a vast 570,665 square miles, but as I said earlier, only around 730,000 people live here, which creates a population density of only about a person per square mile, making it the least densely populated state in America. Alaska is also the 49th state to be added to the US, which is really confusing, because its state nickname is the Last Frontier, so you'd think that Alaska is the 50th state, but nope, it's the second to last behind only Hawaii. Stay tuned for that episode. Alaska was added to the Union as a state on January 3rd, 1959, but it was bought by the US nearly 100 years prior, in 1867. At the time of the purchase, it was actually super unpopular. People in the lower 48 were like, dude, why would you waste $7.2 million on a big chunk of ice nearly 1,000 kilometers away from the closest point, which is up in the Washington Territory, which wasn't even a state at that point either. The people hated it so much that they called it Seward's Folly, after Secretary of State William H. Seward, who'd organized the purchase. However, it turns out that Seward Folly was more like Seward's epic purchase, because Alaska was stuffed with gold and oil. So people stopped hating on Seward and started moving to Alaska because of the gold boom. But what happened for America to control of Alaska? Let's go way back to what scientists estimate was the first time a human ever stepped foot in Alaska. It's believed that the Bering Land Strait Bridge between Alaska and Russia became accessible around 30,000 years ago, and the first people to come across it were indigenous peoples I mentioned earlier. The first Europeans to get to Alaska were the Russians in the 1700s, when Vitus Bering, a Russian explorer, made his way from Siberia to the Aleutian island chain. For this reason, we call the water in between Russia and Alaska the Bering Sea. Bering's investigation of Alaskan land sparked a lot of interest from Russia due to the vast space that contained wildlife. The first settlement was made on Kodiak Island in 1784, and although a few native tribes tried to drive the Russians off the coast of the area, it was never enough to stop them from pillaging the land. Nearly 80 years later, oil and gold were first discovered in the region, and then it was bought by the United States. Then, in 1897, the Alaskan Gold Rush began, which beckoned more and more people to consider moving there. 60 years later, the territory was granted statehood by President Eisenhower, and in between the mid-1970s and mid-1980s, the state's population nearly doubled, and has been growing at a pretty solid rate ever since. However, don't be misled by these numbers. The number of native Alaskans in the state has been decreasing. Alaska is far more urban today than it was when the Russians first visited, with nearly 3 out of every 7 Alaskans living in Anchorage, the largest city in the state. Anchorage is inhabited by nearly 300,000 people, 57% of which are white, which makes sense because the basic rule of thumb for me, at least in this state, is that the further north you go, the more indigenous groups there are. Anchorage is, of course, at the south of the state, and is mostly inhabited by white people born in other areas who work for the oil industry. This makes for a very interesting climate politically because, although in most states urban areas are much more democratic while rural areas skew Republican, this doesn't seem to apply to Alaska because the people living in Anchorage work in the oil industry and own guns, making them a demographic that is likely to vote red. We'll get into politics at a later time, though. Anyways, as much as Anchorage is Alaska's most important city, it's still pretty irrelevant for the rest of the world, as Anchorage is at least 9 hours away from 9 out of every 10 industrialized cities, making it feel very isolated. However, don't let this discourage you from potentially moving to Anchorage, as Kiplinger has rated it as the most tax-friendly city in the United States. That being said, Anchorage has no professional sports team. The closest thing they've had in recent memory was a mid-tier hockey team called the Alaska Aces, but they moved to Portland in 2017. The second largest city in state by population is Juneau. Juneau is located in the south and is where hundreds of years ago the Tlingit Native Americans lived. It is also the capital of the state and is home to 32,000 people. It is the second largest city in the US by land area, behind only Sitka. Now, if you're like me and have never heard of Sitka before, let me tell you, this place is actually pretty cool. Not only is Sitka the largest municipality in America, but it also has its own whole island to itself. If you live in Sitka, you're probably fishing for your job. Another notable city in Alaska is Fairbanks, which is located pretty much at the center of the state and has basically the same amount of people as Juneau, but since it's on a much smaller portion of land, they'll have to live with having a couple hundred fewer people. I don't know too much about Fairbanks, but I will tell you that the one native Alaskan I know described it to me as a city full of people who don't want to live in a city. Which makes sense because Fairbanks is one of the more conservative, gun-owning, business-friendly urban areas in America. This is probably due to it gaining a bunch of population because the oil industry in mid-Alaska. But rather, I'd like to imagine that a bunch of people who didn't want to live in an urban area moved to the middle of Alaska, thinking that it would be completely uninhabited, only to find that 30,000 other people had the same idea. One last place I'm going to mention is Utqiagvik, also known as Barrow, and it is notable because this place got me out of the geography bee when I was in 6th grade because I forgot it existed at exactly the wrong time and I'm still very, very salty. Now, the real reason that this place is relevant is because it is the most northern settlement in the United States, and because it is the county seat of North Slope. It is home to the northernmost point in the United States, Point Barrow. It's just a really fascinating place. It has also been inhabited as a settlement for far longer than most Alaskan cities, with people living here for at least 1,500 years. That's pretty crazy because Utqiagvik is within the Arctic Circle, which is the coldest place on Earth. Climate is so extreme that for 65 days in the winter the sun never comes out, and for 65 days in the summer the sun stays up 24/7, more like 24/65, but whatever. However, don't be fooled by the non-stop sunshine during the summer, because on a good day it's just below freezing. On a good day. It was probably even chillier 1,500 years ago due to climate change. Speaking of climate, let's hop right into the joy that is Alaskan weather. Alaska is the coldest state, and for good reason. Let's look at some states, shall we? First of all, I don't think I'd even go out during January, because temperatures during this month range from negative 20 degrees Fahrenheit to negative 30 degrees. Can you imagine going out and being like, it's a roaster, negative 19 degrees is the warmest it's been since Election Day? Poor Alaskans. Although this is coming from a guy who wears hoodies in the summer, so maybe I have very low tolerance for the cold. That being said, on the interior of the state, it gets really hot during the summer, so if you live in a place like Fairbanks, it's probably negative 35 degrees in the winter, but 102 degrees in the summer. However, the southern coasts are more moderate, with temperatures in the summer generally ranging from the high 40s to mid-60s, which is my type of weather. It also explains why most Alaskans live in these moderate regions, because it's probably helpful to be able to, go out a few times a day during the winter. However, if you live in the aforementioned Utqiagvik, you probably don't go out ever, because in July, the hottest month of the year, the average temperature is a whopping 26 degrees Fahrenheit. I'm literally getting cold just thinking about it. Another reason why people probably live in Anchorage is because of its elevation. Anchorage is pretty low lying, with most of it being around sea level. However, the same can't be said for most of the rest of the state. Juneau rests atop the Boundary Ranges. Fairbanks lies between the Ogilvy and Yukon-Tanana Mountains. Well, after you've heard me talking about how extreme Alaska's landscape and climate is, maybe you're thinking, okay UEP, maybe if you're right, why would anybody want to live here? First of all, I want to go to Alaska. It would be cool to experience the temperatures of a place like Utqiagvik or Anchorage for a couple of hours. Now, second and more importantly, 85% of Alaska's economy is made of oil exports. And oil is a huge part of a lot of countries' economies. Think of how rich a lot of nations are in the Middle East. We see a similar thing with Alaska, where we have a lot of people living there because of the oil industry. Meanwhile, commercial fishing is pretty big in the southern part of the state, and according to the Alaska.gov Kids Corner, nearly 6 billion pounds of fish are harvested every year from the state. Why thank you, Kids Corner of the government-managed website I used. Speaking of the governor, who is the governor of Alaska? That would be Mike Dunleavy, a Republican. Dunleavy was first elected in the 2018 midterms, defeating Democrat Mark Begich. Begich was a pretty strong recruit for Democrats there. In fact, he actually won a Senate race in 2008 by a thin margin of 3,900 votes. He also notably comes from a political family. His brother, Tom Begich, is the minority leader of the Alaska State Legislature, and his father, Nick Begich, served as representative from the state from 1971 to 1972, but he tragically died in a mysterious plane crash, and even today, the congressman's body was never found. By the way, some scrub named Don Young came in and won that seat, and he's still in Congress today at the age of 88. Begich's 2008 Senate win was the last time a Democrat represented Alaska in Congress, because when he ran for re-election in 2014, he lost narrowly to Republican Dan Sullivan. Sullivan and Young are two of Alaska's 3 reps in Congress. The other is Republican Senator Lisa Murkowski, who has made herself famous by voting as the most moderate Republican in the Senate. For example, she has voted to confirm nearly all of Joe Biden's cabinet nominees, voted against a lot of Trump nominees when he was president, and voted to convict him on charges of inciting an insurrection earlier this year, and is pretty liberal for her party on social issues. She is the only Republican in the Senate who has consistently voted for LGBTQ rights, and even as recently in March of 2021, she broke with her party on allowing transgender children to play on the sports teams they choose to play on. She's a fascinating senator because of her independence, and similar to Begich, she also comes from a political family. Her father, Frank Murkowski, was both a governor and a senator from the state, and he appointed her to the Senate seat she holds now, in 2002. She has since won re-elections in 2004, 2010, and 2016. Her 2010 re-election bid is especially interesting because even though she lost the Republican Party's nomination, she ran as a write-in and won. You heard me right, she ran as a write-in candidate and won. People had to physically write in her name on the ballot, and she still got a plurality of votes. She ran an awesome campaign, and even ran this clever ad that I really got a kick out of.
The word is Murkowski.
Could you please define that?
Alaska's senior senator in Washington who represents all Alaskans.
Could you please use that in a sentence?
To re-elect Lisa Murkowski, you must fill in the oval and write in her name.
Murkowski. Murkowski.
That is correct.
You get all the easy ones.
I'm Lisa Murkowski, and I approve this message.
Alaska is a weird state politically, but that's not the only thing it's good at. Yep, that's right, it's time to give out our awards for what Alaska is best at. Number 3, freezing temperatures. Alaska is the coldest state in the Union, and even in the summer you might as well wear your ski clothes. Number 2 is the fact that Alaska causes election forecasters like me to get migraines. You've got the long-serving politicians and their families, a weird amount of third-party voters every election, a party that literally wants the state to become an independent country, a write-in candidate winning a Senate race just a decade ago, 2 key political figures named Dan Sullivan, and of course, the fact that Alaska is the one state where rural areas vote blue, where urban areas go red. And lastly, number 1 is just being huge. Colossal, vast, mammoth, ginormous, however you want to say it. I talked a bit about how big Alaska is at the beginning, but it still deserves reiteration. And of course that there's Denali, the largest mountain in all of North America. And with that, we're done. There was so much to unpack here, and I know I couldn't get to everything, believe me, I tried, but I hope you enjoyed it. If you learned something, let me know by leaving a like and subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. This takes me weeks to put together, but it only takes you a second to hit the like button and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.